I'm really excited to welcome Morton Subotnick on stage with me. It's really great to have you here, and thanks for doing this. And I think, hopefully this will be a way of discussing music that works for you. Because I think when we look at your work, it's a long career of exploration and curiosity and questions and discovery about sound and process and time and space and how all these things work together. As a composer, obviously you're known for solo electronic works as well as works for very different kinds of ensembles, music for theatre, music for kind of live multimedia, audio-visual, things like that. But also there's, we were just talking about this before we started, there's also this long experience of working in the development of music technology and working in education as well. Starting with the founding of the San Francisco Tape Music Center in 1962, but also very important positions in institutions such as CalArts and NYU, and you're still teaching now, as we were just discussing. And this is a way of working, I think, like going between composing, making music, working with technology, being like what we would call now a developer, also an educator, which I think for many of today's electronic musicians feels quite natural. But I think maybe we forget that it's your generation of artists who kind of set that in motion in a way, that kind of multidisciplinary way of working with sound. So, yeah. Can I get started? Would you like to hear some music?
I think we're done.
I think we're done. Okay. So this is the first track I'm going to play. Is that sounding at all familiar to you?
As a piece, no, but as a kind of piece, yes.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought.
It sounds like something that would have been done in like 1963, 1964. A tape recorder and oscillators. And Pauline's first pieces were like that. And it sounds closer to her than, say, Usachevsky, who was also...
You're absolutely right. It's Pauline Oliveros. Yeah, well done. Wow.
How many do I need to get another bottle of water?
Yeah, I have to say, it's really nice that you just clapped, but it's not a test.
No, I was kidding.
But yeah, no, you were bang on there. It was Pauline, and it was a piece of hers from 1964 or 1965. So a few years ago, she released Reverberations, which was a box set of her electronic works spanning 50 or more years, and that was... hang on. Oh, it's still going. I'll leave it on in the background. Is that okay? Yeah. That was a piece that she made.
Turn that off?
Do you want me to turn it off while we're talking?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's too hard to hear. Sure, no problem. That was a piece that she made at the San Francisco Tape Center, and so I guess that's something which is associated with you and Pauline Oliveros and Ramon Sender as co-founders
Right.
of that space. And I wanted to talk a bit about that. I mean, the word experimental is, I think, obviously used, maybe overused when we talk about music now. But when I think about the sort of real meaning of that word, somewhere like the San Francisco Center is this truly experimental space in that you are genuinely quite literally experimenting there, not just with composition, but with making, building, performing. It seemed like a space of like super experimental energy.
Yeah, well, what exactly is the question? Oh, I mean, I'll answer, but I can talk about this. But why don't you, what is the question exactly?
That's a good question.
Well, it doesn't have to be. I can just talk about it.
No, actually, I do have a question. I guess one thing that interests me personally about that period and about that centre is that it opens at a time when throughout Europe and the US, people are opening electronic music studios, right? And they are generally associated with a university, or like here in Germany, they're associated with the radio company, Westdeutsche Rundfunk, or whatever, and whichever country. But in San Francisco, obviously there's an association with Mills College, but the center itself was independent, and it was like an independent space. And I wanted to ask about what that was like, setting something up in that way, with that kind of DIY, I guess, independence, and why you did it like that.
Okay, first of all, it was not associated with Mills College.
Right.
It was an independent thing that Pauline and Ramon and I were doing a series in the late 50s, along with Terry Riley and a few other people. But it was a series that was held at the conservatory, San Francisco Conservatory, called Sonics, I think. And we were doing concerts. They were doing it, and I came into the scene, and Ramon and Pauline started it, and I came in the next year, and we were doing concerts of new music. And the things were getting more interesting in many ways. The final concert we did of a particular season would have been 1959, I believe. We were the community in San Francisco of the young artists and so forth. It was the beginnings of found art, where a re-establishing a sort of a doing this to the establishment, and so there was found art. There were various kinds of things going, and we did this concert where I don't remember which person. Each one of us thinks we did it, but so I don't know which it was. But somebody found a tape. I thought I did it, so I'll tell you what I thought. I remembered a tape, a box of audio tape that in an alley that was next to a garbage can that obviously got missed into the garbage can, and so we were preparing for a concert to produce the last series. So I got this idea, and I put tape over it, so sealed it without listening to it, and we decided. Ramon and I decided that we would do an opera that we called it. I was working with the Ann Halpern Dance Company, and they wanted to do something on the concert, and they had found a new perfume that had just come out we have these things now also, where you could decide, well, today I feel like I want to be happy, or today I'm going to be melancholy, or whatever it is, and they give you formulas for mixing odors, and then you can make your own color for that day and odor and then spray yourself. So the Ann Halpern Dance Company had this idea that they would go through the audience and have the people tell them what they felt like, and then they would put the perfume together and spray the person. And so we decided to make an opera called Opera for Found Tape and Smells. And so while this tape would be played for the first time, we'd never heard, it would go on, and then they would come through, and Ramon had made a percussion section for it with rocks of different sizes inside of steel washing machines. So they would get going, and then they would throw so you can imagine
Incredible.
that, we didn't know what the tape was going to have on. We thought it was going to be music or something. It turned out to be a Sunday morning religious show, not a show, it was a radio show of an interview with a preacher and a woman who had had a child out of wedlock. And and this was the text that we were listening to, with the rocks going and these people coming through and doing it. The smell. The review the next day was, you could not imagine anyone ever having a better review. It said, "Concert literally stinks."
Amazing.
And the college got sued because he didn't really sue them, but he threatened to sue them in the newspaper because he couldn't get the odor out of his new suit.
Oh, no.
So we were not invited back to for the next season. Pauline went off to Holland. She had a residency, got a prize of some sort. And Ramon and I, Ramon called me. He had a little studio there, and I had a studio in my garage. And Pauline was gone. We had no concert series. And Ramon called one day and said, "Why don't we pool our stuff and start and make a studio?" So it wasn't like we were making a studio for the world. It was just a studio. And I was playing with the San Francisco Symphony as an extra, and I knew this woman who had donated money to the San Francisco Symphony, and she also had just bought a Stradivarius string quartet of instruments for one of the famous string quartet in the world. And we're talking in those days, this was 1960, I guess, or something like that. That's probably $1 million. I don't know what it would be today. So I asked her if she would give us a little money so we could buy some equipment. She said, "Well, I'd be happy to help you, but you have to become nonprofit." And so we hired a lawyer. It cost us $110, and we became nonprofit. But then we had the problem, what's the name of your nonprofit corporation? And so Europe was having this battle. Cologne, you were not allowed to bring a microphone into the Cologne Electronic Music Studio because it had to be all electronic. Mm-hmm. And then in Paris, you could not bring an oscillator in. It had to only have a microphone because it was musique concrète. And so we decided we'd call it the Tape Music Center because anything on a piece of tape was music.
Right.
So that became the San Francisco Tape Music Center, and so it had no other reason but that, and we were now nonprofit. Except when she sent her check, she sent a check for $25, which we put on the wall. We never spent. So we ended up spending, $75 or so to become nonprofit.
Right,
but
right.
That started everything, and then from then one thing just led to another. Now I'd like just to comment about the experimental part. Even then, things were being called experimental, but at least for me, and I'd say for several of us, there was an experimental music. Experimental music for me, and always has been, not just looking back, from the beginning, was having an idea that you wanted to see what would happen if you do X, Y, or Z. What kind of sound would that produce? What kind of music, what kind of event would that produce? It was an experiment which had a proposal. You don't use your intuition when you're writing this piece. You don't have ideas about what you want. You want to see what's going to happen when you do X, Y, and Z. You may have some idea what it might be, but but that's an experiment. It's a kind of scientific approach to an art. But everything that is strange is not experimental.
Right.
We're always experimenting. You experiment with what you're wearing. I do that with my socks and my shoes.
Right. Yeah.
There's nothing experimental about it, really, in any official sense. It's more art, in a sense, when you experiment with what you're going to wear, because you look at it. You don't just say, what would happen if I don't wear my clothes when I go outside? Well, you know what's going to happen when you don't. I think there's a difference. And when you listen to Pauline's piece, it sounds experimental because we've heard, people using, like Lamont Young setting up an interval and knowing it's going to produce, because it's not going to repeat in 5 months. It's not going to come back to it. So you set up something in motion. He doesn't intercede. He went through, this is early on, he went through a whole period of 4 months where he had to sleep only certain so he could catch as much of it as he could every day for the whole 4 months to see what it would be, that interval, because he worked it out mathematically to see. That's an experiment. I mean, it's an art. It's an experimental art form. But Pauline's piece is not that. You can hear right from the start.
Yeah, you can hear the process.
She introduces things because this is the time to introduce something.
Right.
But it does have the high tones that beat. So you think, oh, well, there's another experimental piece. But you can tell right away that this is not, because she's introducing something. It has there's an intuitive process going on as it goes. So this is more traditional. This is not a value judgment by any means, because this is what I do too. So I'm not value judging it, but it has more of a traditional approach to art in that sense, and I think it's a point to making experimental music with the name experimental, but it should be kept to the experimental because there you were supposed to, we're going to experience that music with everybody else to see what the experiment produced. Whereas this, we're seeing what Pauline wanted at that point. And there's a big difference between that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess we could think of it more use the word intuition. I think, talking about it more as intuitive music perhaps is more useful. Or, I mean, with Pauline's music from that time, when you listen, you hear, you can almost hear the decision making happening in real time. You hear the process. It's kind of concerned with process. And I guess the kind of technological experiments or kind of experiments around, using experiments in the wrong way, but the work you were doing around sound and sound making at that time, it comes from a similar intuitive, quite spontaneous kind of place.
Yeah, we're getting off on, I'm not sure where we go with this. It's complicated.
Maybe we should have another piece of music.
It would be hard, because
see what happens.
You could go through all sorts. One thing that's happened is that we have so many new categories that keep unfolding. It's like I used to think of a onion that way. It just keeps, you never get to the bottom of it. It just keeps, keeps going. But this is an onion in the making. We don't know how big it's going to be, how many layers it's going to have at the end. It's a giant onion, I think, the universe, maybe.
Yeah, I think once we start talking about ideas like sound and process, that it can become sort of infinite, can't it? And actually, one thing I'd like to talk about at some point in this conversation is the idea of constraints and how that really helps or kind of shapes electronic music and sound, like when you're working with limited resources or when you have what feels like infinite possibilities, and how those kinds of ideas kind of shape what happens.
Yeah, well, this is a big, huge issue, really. Interesting, but I don't know that we can... I think it's best not to label things too soon. I think the best way, for me, the best way is to label them when you're finished.
Right.
And never going to do it again. Because otherwise, you may stunt the growth. I mean, think of raising a child and telling them you're going to be a doctor because you're doing this. Why not let the kid do this and then that, and then after they become something, you say, you've become a doctor, instead of saying, you're going to be a doctor. And I think we should say that about ourselves. I don't know what I'm going to be, but I'd like to try this, I'd like to try that. I'll tell you a quick story. My mother was very worried about her younger brother, my uncle. She said to me one day, she said, I'm very worried about Maury. That was his name. That's another story, but I won't tell you that. And I said, what's the problem? And she said, well, he just keeps going from job to job. He doesn't seem to know what he wants to do. I said, Mom, he's 62 years old. I think this is what he is.
This is what he does. Yeah. Just keep him moving. It's great. Shall I play another track?
Yes.
Okay. Any thoughts?
So it sounds like either Schoenberg or Berg, but it sounds very much in that late expressionist style. I don't know, what is it?
It's actually Charles Ives from his second string quartet. From Charles Ives.
Oh, Charles.
Yeah.
Good old Charles Ives, yeah. He went that way too.
He did.
Yeah.
And that was composed around 1913. So around the same time he was writing his fourth.
It was. I was going to say it's not 12-tone, but it has that that quality. Yeah.
It's an unusual one, isn't it, for him?
It's not a typical Charles Ives, but it was. He did those experiments.
The reason I picked it, I think, was it is quite atypical, absolutely. But there was something in. I was listening to some Ives, thinking about talking to you, and I was thinking about the way that the melody works in that it kind of shifts a lot, and towards it's a third movement of the second string quartet, and as it progresses, it's a shame we just listened to a minute or so, but as it goes on, it kind of comes together more in what you would recognise as that kind of Ivesian, kind of very melodic sort of sense,
right.
and I was thinking about like. ideas around sound and kind of shifting tones and thinking that there was a kind of resonance.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Yeah, I wouldn't have associated that with Charles Ives, and I didn't know. I do know the string. That's the earlier string quartet. It's not the famous one.
The first one is the famous one with all the kind of hymn tunes and American.
Yeah, but it had four people, each one with a different name and so forth. No, this is a different. I'm not too familiar with that one, but what's interesting about what Charles Ives did throughout, I was very influenced by Charles Ives when I was young. I was 15 or 16 years old, and in high school, and I just hated high school. Oh, I hated school, and I couldn't deal with it. And then this one man had a harmony class. I was doing music early in the day before I went to school, and then after school I would do music, and then I went to school to sleep. And this man had a harmony class, and I thought, I was studying on my own and learning music on my own. I thought, well, I'll take a course on harmony. That would be great. I could stay awake for once in a while, once a day. And so I went in, and he knew immediately that I had already done everything he was going to teach. So he took me to Monday evening concerts where I heard Schoenberg and met Schoenberg and Stravinsky, and hearing all these things, and introduced me to the Concord Sonata of Charles Ives at 15 years old. I wrote to, I forgot who was the biographer, but there was someone writing the biography, and I wrote a couple of letters, which he never answered, but to find out more about him, because there were no recordings at the time. It was just if it was, I didn't hear it. Just the music itself, and it just changed my whole life. It was really important to me. And one of the things that because the Concord Sonata was the first work I really knew thoroughly of Charles Ives. One thing is that he has all these quotes, but what's really important in it, in the music, is that he's all over the place. It's music, and then somehow it coheses, which is what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Here it's just with a chord here and a chord there, but otherwise you go, so and then it goes off in something.
Yeah.
And what music was about for several hundred years, not Gregorian chant, not in the Renaissance, not in the Middle Ages, but starting around 1600, for the 17th century, 18th century, and 19th century in the West, music became about, it had a subject. Ta-ta-ta-ta, it starts there. Everything is about that.
Yeah. Charles
Ives, and then you would have transitions. Charles Ives starts with a transition. And every once in a while, you end up somewhere. And this was the discovery, or the basic discovery of Schoenberg. Charles Ives didn't get it from Schoenberg, but this was Schoenberg also established this with his students, that if you make the subject the important thing, you lose 90% of the music. The music is speaking to you, and Sartre later, not so much later actually, just a few years later now when I think about it, said music doesn't mean anything, it's meaningful. And so the meaningfulness disappears when you only deal with the subject. And Charles Ives had this that's the one thread that goes through all his music, which is it meanders all over the place, and every once in a while lands. Mm-hmm. And as they're transitions. They're becoming something. It's in always becoming. Then it's there, and then it goes off to another place, or might come back again. So even in this rather abstract, melancholy, mysterious string quartet, the chords somehow our little, that's what fooled me, because I said, it can't be really sure, because he wouldn't have used the chord. So it wasn't 12 tone, but it was like, very much like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I say, the whole piece kind of work into this much more kind of resolved.
And if you heard what I did last night,
sure.
that's exactly what I've been doing ever since that I was 16 years old, is that things turn into things. And then if you do the larger scale, it falls into the same category, except those things become something else again, somewhere else. And so what you heard at the very beginning was literally a transition. I mean, that is where this is the body of what I do.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, in fact, I was thinking last night that there were those, it did feel like, I'm sure most of you were here at the concert as well, but yeah, it was always in motion. There was always, I like that you used the phrase "always becoming," which is kind of also like a concept in philosophy as well, isn't it? In a way, but it really does feel like that. I also wanted to play that because it's a string quartet, and obviously you've worked with lots of different kinds of ensembles and different groups.
With what?
With a string quartet.
Yeah.
And obviously, you've worked with many different forms of ensembles and groups and chamber groups, and the string quartet, I think, is one that it's to me, it's like a very perfect kind of musical grouping in some way, if that makes sense. And I wondered what it kind of meant to you, like those ideas about groups and ensembles, and how you kind of work with that.
Well, I think the string quartet I love the string quartet, I really do. I wrote, one of my favorite pieces that I did was for the Juilliard, A Fluttering of Wings, and it has the same thing. It's just all over it starts with this thing that just goes all over the place, and every once in a while it pops into things, and it's electrified, so it's moving in space and things. I think of I'm lecturing about in New York once a week right now. This part of the lecture series is about software, music software, and how music software itself, the very fact of it, the way it's made, you can backwards go to the source of what the person was thinking, and what the person thought of was music, or what aspect they're doing, by the way that it unfolds. And that you at the other end are then getting you're being told, if you took a music lesson and they say, don't play it that way, play it this way. Well, that's maybe not the right way to teach. You may want to play it that way and develop it. With software, the person doing it, the programmer, not on purpose, but the programmer is offering you something that tells you what you're supposed to do. And so, wait a minute, where was the question? I lost it. A string quartet.
It's about string quartets, but this is really...
So if I say, I want you to write a string quartet, if someone came to me and said, I want you to write a string quartet, and I'd say, okay, I write them a string quartet. How about banjo, double bass, you get the picture. String quartet, when you say the word, means cello, viola, and 2 violins. And what that means is that what you're thinking of is not a quartet, but a single stringed instrument which can be played from low to high and has all the same quality. It's the same. It's an instrument. The string quartet that we call is an instrument, and so the solo Bach violin things are for just one instrument. But if you stretch it out, you can write that piece for several instruments that do the same thing. And if you think about a Bach solo violin piece, or the solo cello ones, he has counterpoint in there. You can pick out the lines as they go. You just expand that, it becomes easier, and you're writing a string quartet, right? So in Mozart, 18th century string quartets, you had the cello and the first violin, and they were the two important things, and then the rest of the chords. the inner parts were the other ones. The great story of the violist in our society is that the violist in the opera orchestra gets a day off and goes to listen to an opera, and they're going, and he or she says, "Oh, I thought it went pop, 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 pop."
Like they're just cogs in the machine or something, yeah. Can I play another track? Thanks. Yeah, okay.
Well, I'm pretty sure I don't know that piece, and I would. It has to be. Let's see, 19. It has to be after 1975.
And why do you say it has to be after 1975?
Because Phil Glass happened.
Right.
It was after the Phil Glass transformation of the Steve Reich thing, which allowed for that. Never heard a piece before that. I think that was why both Steve and Phil were so important, is that nobody ever did anything like that before that.
Right.
And
absolutely. Yeah.
so the Steve Reich. Well, of course, Terry. We premiered in C at the Tape Center in 1964, and Steve was in it. He played the and and Steve's concert was. Each of us were supposed to do I can do it fast because we get to the other question. We were supposed to do a concert that season. Each one of us in town had our full concert, and Terry, one of us, we never knew which one. One of us asked. Terry was coming back from Paris, and we said, can you do a concert in November? Yeah. Could you write a piece for us that everyone can play? That was in C. So, because in C is easy to play in, right? Mm-hmm. You don't have any sharps or flats. So, but so Terry beat them at that.
Yes, absolutely.
In that sense. Yeah. But in another sense, Steve's was really a first in a way, because he had this thing where it had a trajectory. It went all the way somewhere and came back and ended. There was a beginning and an ending, and everything else was a transition, but a transition that it needed to do. Mm-hmm. Phil made and he was dealing with the tempo changes for the pulse. So they were the tempo was going out of phase. Very hard to listen to. Bill had another take, which was
Sorry.
Which was, we're going to repeat this pattern, da-da-dee, 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 and he nodded when it was time to go to the next da-da-dee, da-dee, da-da-dee, da-dee, da-da-dee, da-da-dee, and he would actually tell you, I mean, he would decide at the moment how many repetitions there would be. That would be impossible for Steve, because he had this, you have to, no, you just decide when you want to do it. This person is deciding when they're going to do that.
Yeah, well, I think the reason they're deciding is because they're working with a computer. That's why I was wondering, well, you were saying after 1975, so it's Laurie Spiegel.
Oh, Laurie Spiegel.
And she's working with a computer, so obviously she has decided because it's programmed. And that was one of Laurie's pieces that she made using the Groove hybrid, digital analog system at Bell Labs in around 1976, 77. And yeah, I mean, I wanted to mention Laurie Spiegel because prior to her experiments with computer music, which is the thing that she's best known for now, she really discovered electronic music via the Buchla that was in your studio. She was one of the people that visited your studio in the 60s in New York. And I know for her that was a really important experience for her.
Elaine Radigue and Charlemagne Palestine and a whole bunch of people,
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was it like when people came to? So you had your studio. You were working at NYU. You were an artist.
Well, I wasn't
in
at NYU.
No, you were the artist in residence.
It was
yeah.
above the Bleecker Street Cinema, across the street from the the bars and the clubs. It was at the peak of this thing. You would never have thought you were at anywhere near NYU. Well, so it's a mistake. It was sponsored by NYU, but it was my studio because this wasn't part of, the studio was not part of NYU. It was
yours.
It was my personal studio. But I did work many hours a day, maybe 12, 14 hours a day, mostly at night. And but there were 24 hours in a day, and people just came in. Charlemagne and Palestine and Ingram Marshall just hopped in one day, and they said, we've heard you got this thing, and they loved it. And they said, can we do it? I taught them how to do it, and I said, sure. Everybody, anyone who wants to come can, not anyone. You have to talk to me, but sure, you have to participate in some way. So someone had to sweep the floor once a week, and someone had to do something else, and they just came in. They got their time and whatever they needed, and I didn't even know Laurie Spiegel was working there.
Right.
It was a pretty much. We had a thing. Beware. A surveillance camera that we didn't have a lock on the door. Beware. So, and we had a camera, but it was a casing with nothing in it. And that was our security for the place.
And yet you had this synthesizer there, which was, a real one-off. I mean, if you must have been, obviously you were not too worried. You trusted everyone that came in, right?
Pardon?
I mean, you had this no security, and yet you had this incredibly important synthesizers.
Nobody thought it was important.
Right.
It wouldn't have been there if they thought it was important.
Yeah, I guess.
We had one person, I forgot his name now, but I don't know if you know the Vasulkas, the video artists. Well, they've answered. I hadn't met them yet. I had Reese Chatham was. I had never made more than $5,000 in a year until I came to New York. And suddenly I was going to make $10,000. And I felt so guilty. I just felt, oh my God, I've become part of another thing. So the first thing I did, the very first full day I had in New York, I went to the 3rd Street Music Settlement and offered my services for poor kids on Saturday. So Saturday, one of the kids was Reese Chatham. And so he got his lessons, and Reese Reese met the Vasulkas, and I had this one composer, came from Illinois somewhere, and he was moving to New York, and he asked if he could get an hour a week in there, and I gave him a job, and he got an hour and 2 hours, 1 day a week. So I gave it to him. The Vasilkas, when they learned there was this Buchla, they from Reese, he had showed them and everything. They found an ad in the paper where somebody was having free 2 hours in their apartment with a Buchla synthesizer for $20. So they went and used that. It was this guy, he took the entire studio out, the Buchla, and took it to his apartment, made $40 a week, and then brought it back. Wow,
there's this whole like underground economy of
it was
of the
great,
Buchla.
and we had at night. We had at night when the clubs were closed. The village gate was a block down, and we had people from the rock bands would come by at 2 o'clock in the morning. I was working all night, and I had an old sofa in there, and they would just sit. There was the story I heard later was that there was this mad. I think Rob Young picked it up. I don't know where he got it, but it was there was this mad scientist working on a musician working on the experimenting with the moment of the ecstatic moment, searching for the ecstatic moment. So they'd all come in to watch this mad scientist working with these machines with the lights. There was nothing like it in the world. You know, the Moog hadn't even come in yet, and when it did, it didn't look anything like that. And
no, I mean the Buchla is such an enticing instrument, isn't it? I think anyway. I mean, I just find them like magnetic, you know, and they're very tactile, and
it was made to touch and move and plug in, and everything was apparent. Lights going by, and so they would come in, and actually Silver Apples happened one night when there were a group of 3 or 4 of them in the room, and this man, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and somebody from Warhol's movie group was there, Ultraviolet was there, and they were all there. This guy comes in a double-breasted suit, and I was very suspicious, you know. And I'd been giving lectures, public lectures on the record is a new important medium of music, and we should not. It would be immoral and unethical to do Beethoven string quartets that were intended to be played in public on a record. We should have people with record companies would know this, and they would commission composers to make new pieces, especially for the record. So this guy comes in, and I never thought, you know, I knew that would never happen, but it was the ideal of what you want to reach. And this guy comes in, and he gives me my speech, and he says, "And we'd like you to be the first, and we'll give you $500." And I rarely get angry, but I was really angry with him, and I kicked him out because he was making fun of me. And you know, I was angry. I had to get my kids off to school in the morning, so I get back to the apartment, which was a block away, and before I woke them up, I had this Brandenburg concerto I played every morning to bring me down to be able to deal with getting the kids off, getting them breakfast and off to school. And I look at the record label, and it says None Such. And this guy said he was the president. That's what also bothered me. He gave me this name, None Such Records. What kind of a crazy name is that for a record? And so I realized I had bought it because it was 58 cents or something for the record. I didn't notice the label until then. I couldn't reach None Such Records. Couldn't find a phone number for them all day long. I thought, oh my God, I just gave away this whole thing. He comes in again, and then a different group of these people are there. And the conversations this is 1965, the conversation, the intellectual conversation like we're having right now, went on the sofa. It was, and this was I didn't know anyone's name. No one ever introduced themselves to me. It was just this thing that went on. So he comes in again around the same time, and I reach out because I'm going to go to my knees and say, I'll do it for nothing. And he goes like this. He said, "Now, take it easy." He said, "Don't kick me out." He said, "We've had a long talk about this. We've doubled the price. We'll do it for $1,000." I said, "I'll take it." And that was Silver Apples of the Moon. But that was the scene at that moment.
Yeah, and that's as you reminded me before we started talking, it's the 50th anniversary of that record next year.
The what?
The 50th anniversary of the record next year.
2017.
Yeah. And you're planning to do a tour based around it.
Yeah, I'm going to do Silver Apples Revisited, because Silver Apples of the Moon was never performed. The whole notion was a studio art. Now that's so common that you don't even think about it, but it didn't exist. That was probably the first instance, or one of the earliest. It wasn't the first, I'm sure, but one of the earlier instances of studio art outside of using just the tape recorder and using records, but having the instrumentation. The Buchla was designed to do that, to be the source of this, to make music, and so it was a moment, and it's 50 years old. It's really amazing, almost as old as me.
I'm going to move along to another track because we're going to run out of time, I think, unless we can go over a bit. I don't know.
Well, we're on. Oh, okay.
We're doing okay for now. So. I keep choosing these slowly unfolding songs, which is a bit of a problem for this format. It's a shame we can't, this is like 13 minutes long.
I can tell where it's going,
any ideas?
No, I actually, it sounds interesting. I don't know, I don't know if I've heard it before, but it would have to be probably in the 80s at this point.
Absolutely, yeah.
And using, we had mixers and better, more access to tape recorder technology. So we're, you're dealing with loops and expansion, time shift, and things that we wouldn't have had before.
Yeah, and obviously the beginnings of sampling, which that track uses an early sampler. So it was made by, any idea? Or do you want me to tell you? Shall I tell you who it was made by?
Who was made?
It's made by Carl Stone. Who's, sorry. Carl,
I thought about Carl, but I didn't know.
Well, he's done so many
I never heard this.
Right. It's a piece of his from 1986. And actually, of course, well, I mean, as you know Carl well, but like his music I mean, like a lot of people, but I think him very particularly doesn't like fit into any template. Like he can produce some very different music. So
I've known a lot of his pieces. I don't know that. Carl, you know the story of Carl?
I know that you taught Carl at Cal Arts.
I sort of did. When Cal Arts started, I was trying to make this short, but we were concerned with getting the 0.5% of people who didn't belong in any university. People who were they didn't fit anywhere. Give them a place to be able to create and to be who they needed to be. So you had to get in by interviews. You couldn't just send in an application. And I had this, many people would come and I wouldn't take them. And this one young man came to me and he wanted to do this very much, and he was very young. He was just out of high school, and I gave him a list of names of composers. He didn't know any of them. And so I said, well, I'm sorry, but it's very wonderful that you want to do this, but I don't want to be responsible for a young man like you getting involved in something you can never make a living with. And, he played the guitar in a band or something, and I said, when you listen to this music, and if this is the kind of thing you think you are going to be interested in doing, come back and we can talk. And in the meantime, we also had an open thing where anyone who was accepted could take anything they wanted, and we suddenly had 70 students wanting to work in 2 studios. And I won't go through the whole story, but I had Charlemagne and Ingram and my graduate students they were graduate students I brought from New York. Sarah Cherepnine, who was brought as a faculty member. I brought these people from New York who were just working in the studio, and I said, come on, we'll give you fellowships, come to Cal Arts and you can work and be. So they became people teaching. And then we needed more because we couldn't get rid of these people. It was getting ridiculous. And so there was this one kid who was just fantastic in the class, really sharp. And I said, hey, would you like to, I didn't even know what his name was. I said, would you like to do it? He said, yeah, I could use some money. I said, okay. Tell them you go to the office and tell them to give you a fellowship and a stipend, and you come and do that. And he comes back and he says, they won't do it. And I said, what the hell? I said, I'm running this damn place. What do you mean they won't do it? So I call the person, and they say, Carl Stone is not a student here. He had come anyway. He just came. And so I said, he's now a student. So I give him the fellowship. Right. He stayed for 6 years, and but he didn't know anything about music. And we didn't have any courses to teach. We didn't have music history and things like that. So I put him in charge of the music appreciation room at Cal Arts, which was a room full of pillows, and we would have records played. And people would come in and listen, and we would, one week would be the music of Scarlatti, the next would be Edgar Varese, and they were getting their music history, and I said, you get the records, take the liner notes, look up whatever, you make the notes for this, and know the music you're picking. You're the DJ of our music history course. And that he ended up being probably the first DJ. And it was really amazing, and he's still doing it to this day, No,
I mean, I read an interview with him where he said that you taught him like a new way of listening to music, that you really taught him how to listen, which I think is such an amazing thing, really. I mean, it's so important, isn't it? Do you feel that the way, maybe it's different now, but particularly back then, the way that music was taught, that listening maybe was not focused on enough, that you learn to listen, you have to learn to analyze music when you study music, but this idea that listening is like the most important thing, and that there are new ways to listen.
Yeah, and the other thing was that the very reason I didn't accept him gave him his first real job, because he worked for years in radio stations playing records.
Right.
And running shows, and that's how he made his living. So who knows? That's why I didn't want to get into some of the things you said before. They're too big, and you don't know the answer to them. But I do know the answer to these.
Yeah. Obviously, Carl Stone is someone who's still working now, but the music of his I've listened to recently is this music from the 80s, where there's like the transition, and it's not really a transition, it's a coexistence of digital and analog technology, and like the beginnings of computing being, you know, a central part of music making. How was that for you?
I'm sorry?
How was that for you, that those developments, you know, the start of MIDI, things like that?
Well, how do you mean? I mean...
was it exciting to have all this new possibilities?
You know, I started when I gave up the clarinet and that whole world, I went into it because there was a brand new world going to be out there, and I wanted to offer something at the beginning of that. That's all I was involved in. I had no idea what the music... I knew that what I was going to do was not going to be what these people were going to do. Carl Stone is a good example. He didn't know music when he came at that point. He could never have written a piece for orchestra or something. He could now probably, but it would be still minimal compared to what he could do the other way. So I wasn't part of their... I had this huge background in music.
Okay.
Yeah, we have to quit, huh?
Yeah.
Finish.
Sorry.
But you see, I didn't have a judgment about what the music should be.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just, you know, I'll be 84 in a couple of months. I just to have had this vision and to see it happening, it has nothing to do with whether I like it or what I don't like it. I didn't care what it was going to be. I just knew it was going to be, had to be different from what we did.
Yeah.
And up to that point. And it certainly is.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I'm really sorry we have to finish now. I feel like I have so many more questions for you, but thanks so much for taking the time to do this, and thank you for listening. Yeah.